Well, good afternoon, and thank you for coming to this talk. It's a great pleasure to welcome Brad Podliska back to Aggie Land. Dr. Podliska, as he's now known, is an assistant professor of military and security studies at Air University. And prior to that, he worked as an investigator for the U.S. House of Representatives Select Committee on Benghazi. He did his PhD here in political science at Texas A&M and in international relations. Today he's going to offer us his insider's view of the politically divisive committee. He will discuss his new book, Fire Alarm, which details why the committee failed to deliver an accurate assessment of the events and the potential government shortfalls surrounding the September 11, 2012 attack in Benghazi. If you have any questions, we ask you to write them on the note cards that the ambassadors will hand out, and we can start with those. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Brad Podliska.
Hi, well, good afternoon. I'm Bradley Podliska, yes, the author of Fire Alarm. I want to start it this way. When you hear the word Benghazi, what comes to mind? I'm sorry? Terrorist attack? Absolutely. It was a well-organized, well-planned terrorist attack. Anything else? The movie, 13 Hours. Actually an excellent movie, highly accurate. Fiasco? Absolutely. It's, my promise to you is actually worse than probably what you've heard in terms of not the attack itself, but the investigation and the actual attack. What about the name Hillary Clinton? Yeah, certainly. I'm going to talk a lot about Hillary Clinton, but I'm also going to talk about things such as Con-Plan 0300, the joint planning process, a gentleman by the name of Jake Sullivan. And my argument here is going to be that the Benghazi story has been told to you by politicians, specifically 10 congressional investigations. And the Benghazi truth hasn't been out there. Indeed, in this terrorist attack where Ambassador Christopher Stevens, Information Officer Sean Smith, and 2 CIA operatives, Glenn Doherty and Tyrone Woods, were killed in a very well-planned, well-organized terrorist attack on September 11th in Benghazi, Libya, we've had this tragedy. And I'm going to argue that this tragedy has been exploited for political gain, but we really haven't had any accountability with this. We certainly haven't had any reforms, and we really haven't had the truth when it comes to this. So my talk is going to be in 2 parts. The first part is going to be kind of an examination how we got to this partisan process when it comes to congressional investigations. I have to admit, when I came out in October 2015, I said the Benghazi Committee's partisan investigation. I expected it to be accepted as common sense. I didn't expect the politicians to come out of the woodwork. Basically, even Trey Gowdy said, hey, shut up. This is an objective investigation. I was kind of taken by surprise by that. So the first part of my talk is going to be an examination. Are congressional investigations partisan? And the second, if they are partisan, what's actually been missed when it comes to the Benghazi attack and the Obama administration response? I'm going to argue a whole bunch. So with that said, I am a government employee. Standard disclaimer, these views are my own, not those of the DOD, U.S. government, U.S. Air Force, not certainly the Benghazi Committee. I'm going to start with 2 seemingly disconnected videos. The first is going to be from January 25th, 2012. President Obama is walking up to the lectern to give the State of the Union address. He's going to single out Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta and say good job to him as he walks up. Now, what this is about is early in the day, Special Forces had done a hostage rescue operation. They rescued an American Jessica Buchanan and a Danish citizen, Paul Thiested. Highly, highly successful operation. What hasn't been told to you, certainly not in the Benghazi report, is this is going to set the mindset for not only Secretary Panetta, but the rest of the officials in Washington when they first learn of what's going on in Benghazi. They're going to assume they're facing a repeat of January 25th, 2012, and they're going to, once again, do the same exact thing for that hostage rescue. This is really bad if you're military. Military, you're trained not to do this, because if you make an assumption, that assumption becomes risk, that risk becomes mission failure. And in fact, there's processes in place to avoid this. Second video is going to be of trying to be Speaker, Newt Gingrich, in fall of 1994. Republicans have not controlled the House since 1952. Newt Gingrich is going to come up with a game plan. I have the way for the Republicans to take back the House. He's going to introduce what's referred to as the contract with America.
Basically, Congress is going to follow the same laws as the rest of the American public. This is extremely, extremely successful. The Republicans' landslide election in 1994, they take back the House for the first time since 1952. However, what's going on behind the scenes is Newt Gingrich has introduced fundamental reforms to Congress as an institution itself, where investigations are now going to be controlled by the party. Much detail on that later. So first, President Obama.
Good job tonight. Good job tonight.
We're here because we are taking the first steps, and we're taking them in a contract with the American people. We've already told the incumbents and the candidates that if we have a majority, if the American people accept this contract, that they can expect to work 5 days a week in January, 6 days a week in February and March, and 24 hours a day around the clock towards the end if necessary. But we are going to get to the final recorded votes in the first 100 days on every item.
That's where John Boehner was in the background for that, but I wasn't able to find him in that video. This is what my talk's going to be about. Very simply put, are congressional investigations partisan? And second, if they are partisan, what was missed using the Benghazi investigation as a case study? And spoiler alert. What's that for me? Okay. Oh, I guess I can get comfortable. Very, very simple thesis. Yes, my whole argument here is they are absolutely partisan. They've been partisan since 1995, and it's only getting worse. I'm going to pick on the Republicans a lot today. Democrats play by the exact same rules. In fact, they upped the ante, I would argue, with the January 6th committee. Okay, this is not to say that things have always been smooth between the executive branch and the legislative branch. Going back to 1792, there's a gentleman by the name of President Washington who had launched a military expedition under General St. Clair. On this, about 1,000 guys went out to the Ohio Territory to try to resolve the dispute using military power. Nearly 900 were killed and wounded in this expedition. To date, proportionally speaking, it's one of the worst disasters in American military history. Congress at the time is going to say, President Washington, we want your papers. We want to know why this was a failure. President Washington is going to claim executive secrecy. You can't have my papers. This debate actually continues today. Now, there's high points when it comes to congressional investigations. We had the Teapot Dome investigation of the Harding administration. In this particular case, there's a gentleman by the name of Secretary of the Interior Fall who was getting kickback and bribes from petroleum companies for leasing out public land. Congress investigates this, find a whole bunch of evidence on the guy. They actually sentence and convict him. Then we get to the low points with the House Un-American Activities Committee and the Watergate Committee. In this particular point, it's going to reach a low point. The Army has decided to enlist a staff member that's working for the Chief Counsel, Roy Kahn. At the time, he does not like this. He accuses the Army of being communist. Now, this is the viral video that we've all seen. That's actually an Army lawyer saying, have you no sense of decency? Have you no shame? This ends up being an extremely low point for Senator McCarthy himself. He's, actually black sheep when it comes to Congress, and dies shortly thereafter. And we get to Watergate. We know what happens with Watergate. Nixon is forced to resign. Congress is going to reassert its authority over the executive branch and pass a whole bunch of legislation, particularly when it comes to the Intelligence Community with the Church and Pike committees. However, what they're also doing behind the scenes is they're doing that first fundamental reform to Congress itself as an investigatory body. They are saying now for the committee chairs, you were based on seniority, so if you've been there the longest, you get to be chair next for positions. This is now subject to party vote. So they've taken away that independence from the committee chairs and turned it over to the party. Newt Gingrich is going to say, got you Democrats with Watergate, I'm going to up the ante even more when it comes to the Republicans. In fact, committee chairs are now subject to a secret party vote, so you have to be accepted by the party before you even get into that chairmanship. Second, he's going to set up task forces, so if he doesn't like what a committee's doing, he can simply bypass that task force and introduce legislation to the floor. He's going to say, the congressional staff, way too bloated, we have to cut the bureaucracy. He's going to cut committee staff by a third. However, when he does this, he's going to essentially lop off the research arm of Congress. You're not going to have the staff members that have the subject matter expertise to actually conduct an investigation. This is going to result in a lot of gotcha questions at these hearings from these members of Congress, particularly for the television cameras. So this is kind of the key points here. When it comes to the introductions by Newt Gingrich, remains in place today. Minority Party itself is actually going to be removed from deliberations. As I said, both sides play by these rules. So when Nancy Pelosi takes over, she's going to play by the exact same rules. In fact, she must have read the literature, because when it comes to January 6th committee, they're going to decide we have to publicize this even more. They're going to hire a former ABC News producer to put this onto primetime TV to try to up the ante when it comes to removing a rival political candidate. So bottom line here, the party now controls how these investigations are conducted. So I have up here unified and divided government. Under unified government, this is where one party controls both Congress and the White House. It's in your interest not to bring down a member of your party, regardless of which branch they belong to. So if you're a Democrat now, you do not want to investigate Joe Biden because it's going to bring you down in the process. It's because parties have become nationalized. If you're labeled as a Democrat and you bring down Joe Biden, it's going to hurt all Democrats together. However, if you're in a divided government, this is where your party does not control the White House. It's very much in your interest to bring down that rival president, to bring down that rival presidential candidate. In fact, the literature tells us that if you can conduct 20 days of hearings, you're going to bring down the presidential approval numbers by 2.5%. Under unified government, a couple examples here. When it comes to the Republicans in the Iraq War, 71% of Republicans gave absolutely no speeches critical of how the Iraq War was being conducted, as opposed to 33% of Democrats who gave 10 or more speeches that were critical of the Iraq War. This has really kicked into overdrive post-Watergate. 85% chance if the opposite party takes over Congress, there's going to be 12 or more investigations. So I would say there is an issue that Congress wants to sort its constitutional authority over and conduct oversight, conduct investigations. It has one of two choices. It can either set up, assign it to a committee to investigate, or it can set up a commission. I'm going to talk about the committees today. If it assigns it to a committee, it's going to fall into one of two types of investigations. The first one is what's referred to as a police patrol investigation. This is where Congress, as a matter of routine auditing of the budgets that's submitted to it, finds some wrongdoing, such as maybe the military charging $800 for a wrench. They say, gotcha, executive branch, we're now going to introduce legislation to fix the problem. That is becoming a rarity now. It's much more about fire alarm investigations, where the title of the book takes it from. This is if there's a crisis or a national incident or a third party brings it to the appropriate party's attention, Congress is going to jump in, not with the idea of reform, but in terms of holding somebody accountable. In particular, a presidential candidate of the opposite party or a president of the opposite party. Once again, both sides do this. Why did they do that? Because that partisan brand, AKA partisan reputation, your party reputation. It's in your interest, if you're a Republican, to boost the reputation of Republicans and down the reputation of Democrats, and vice versa. And individual members, when they're assigned to these committees, it's considered highly prestigious. You're the one that gets to slay the dragon. So if you're Trey Gowdy, that's running the Benghazi committee, you can take down Hillary Clinton in terms of being a presidential candidate. So now what I've added to fire alarm with the literature, you need party control over this whole process from top to bottom. So from the Speaker of the House down to the intern that's hired for the committee. And the way that the leadership actually does this, I would argue, is they're going to look at party loyalty. How loyal have you been to the party? There's some quantitative measures of how we get into this. But for example, when John Boehner picks Trey Gowdy to be chair of the Benghazi committee, he knows that Trey Gowdy is going to carry out his agenda, carry out his strategy. He's not there to conduct an objective investigation. John Boehner is going to tell him this is what's best for the party. This is what you should be doing. Trey Gowdy is going to fall right in line with that. Now, I also argue the same applies to the staff. There's a vetting process. If you have Capitol Hill experience, they know what you are like and whether or not you're going to toe the party line. If you do not toe the party line, bad things happen. Everybody has to be rowing in the same direction when it comes to these investigations. So here are some numbers on what this actually looks like. The first one on the left here is called a party unity score. So this is the Republican score, and I'd argue the Democrat scores are actually the same way. How many times have you voted with your fellow Republicans when Democrats have voted the opposite way? You can see here the norm now is over 90% of the time. So if you're a Republican congressman, you're voting with your party 90% of the time or more on average. What does this look like in terms of ideological spectrum? +1 is as most conservative as you can get. -1 is most liberal as you can get. As you can see here, this is once again the Republicans. I'd argue mirror image for the Democrats. Republicans are becoming more and more conservative when it comes to House membership. So focus on post-Watergate. What does this actually look like in terms of investigations? We see that the chairs being selected for these investigations are more loyal to the party as measured by party unity score, and we're getting more and more investigations as time goes on. It's in your interest to keep the opposite party under constant investigation. And indeed, we're seeing this now with President Biden and the Hunter-Biden dealings and all of that. So with that said, we have our fire alarm investigation. The Republicans have this opportunity that arises for dead Americans. Let's try to figure out what went on. Congress is going to launch a series of investigations, 10 in total. Now, the Leviathan of these is going to be the finale of the Benghazi Committee. Benghazi Committee itself is going to create 22,000 pages, interview, I think, 71 new witnesses that none of the other committees had actually investigated, and they're going to promise, and indeed, when Trey Gowdy issues the final report, this has significant findings, new information. You guys didn't know about any of this stuff before. So getting to what the Benghazi focus was on, I have up here a State Department org chart. So obviously, the goal here, as I've cited, is to go after Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, who's running for president in 2016. The bureaucracy itself is going to find wrongdoing with this middle level here. So these folks I have listed here, I'm going to talk a little bit about Patrick Kennedy in the next slide. He and Charlene Lamb were the ones that were intricately involved when it came to Libya and to State Department operations there. In fact, Patrick Kennedy was in charge of all diplomatic facilities overseas. Charlene Lamb was responsible for protecting personnel overseas. Now, in Libya itself, I'm going to talk about this a little bit later, this has become the crown jewel of the Obama administration and for Hillary Clinton's campaign. Want to be able to successfully transition using what's termed smart power, Libya from a failed state into a democracy, sustainable democracy. There's a problem with this. Libya in general has become an extremely violent place, particularly in the summer of 2012. 21 incidents total in 3 months. State Department recognizes this to a certain extent, and there is legislation in place. If you're in a dangerous place, you have to follow this legislation, these requirements if you're going to build a facility. State Department says, we found a way around this. We're going to declare this a temporary facility so that we do not have to abide by these requirements. Now, unfortunately, for those in the State Department, in the field, in Libya itself, they knew it was an extremely dangerous place. They're the ones getting shot at. They're sending memorandum after memorandum back to Washington. We need more stuff. We need more personnel. And our two individuals, Patrick Kennedy and Charlene Lamb, for the most part, are not responding to these requests. It is getting lost in the bureaucracy. In fact, they're actually moving forward in Washington. That temporary compound is going to become a permanent consulate for Hillary Clinton's planned visit in October of 2012. And that is up until
The first video of the attack was captured by cell phones, but it took about 10 more days for the FBI to get its hands on video taken by security cameras at the consulate. That classified video shown to the House and Senate Intelligence Committees answers some of the many questions surrounding the attack. A U.S. intelligence official said it shows no sign the assault arose as first thought out of a demonstration. But it also indicates the attack, though intentional, was not well planned. The video makes clear the attackers did not know the layout of the compound. The attack lasted about an hour and ended with the consulate in flames, a scene captured by a surveillance drone overhead. The surviving Americans retreated to a CIA safe house about a mile away, where they continued to take fire from small arms and rocket-propelled grenades. After another hour, the shooting stopped. For 4 hours, no shots were fired. giving a rescue team flown in from Tripoli time to make its way to the annex. 10 minutes after the rescuers arrived, a second attack began, this time with mortars. That attack was also captured on video, both by security cameras and a drone overhead, and it shows a more organized and deliberate assault than the one on the consulate. Intercepted phone calls and text messages from that night indicate some of those who attacked the consulate were inspired in part by televised scenes of protesters storming the American embassy in Cairo in rage over an anti-Muslim video running on the internet. Others seem to have nothing more in mind than looting. That first attack created an opportunity for the second attack, the one on the annex. Whether it was planned that way all along is not clear.
U.S. officials say the 4-hour...
Okay, we know this video is a little bit outdated. We know now it was an extremely well-organized, well-planned attack. Al-Qaeda had planned it for up to 6 months in advance. Two authors, Ethan Churin and Sarah Adams, have written really good books on how this was actually an Al-Qaeda operation. It had absolutely nothing to do with an anti-Islamic film, as I'll get into, nothing to do with the demonstration. This was a full-blown assault on the compound. And indeed, the assault begins at 9:42 p.m. State Department, as I talked about, don't have the personnel in place to actually protect themselves. They have some local contractors, local national contractors, who immediately run away as soon as the gate itself is stormed. Over the CIA annex, about a mile away, you have our GRS contractors. These are the gentlemen from the 13 Hours movies. They get wind of this. They decide they're going to respond to this. They respond about an hour later. They come under fire. They round up the personnel. They cannot find Ambassador Christopher Stevens. This is going to lead into that game of telephone we're going to see back in Washington, as I'll talk about. Load up the personnel. They're going to go back to the CIA annex where they have much more protection. They're going to become under attack there. And then there's going to be this lull. And this is where the personnel from Tripoli are going to fly in, including Glenn Doherty and Tyrone Woods. Soon after they actually arrive at the annex, they're going to become under a mortar attack, and Tyrone Woods and Glenn Doherty are going to be killed in this. They're eventually going to round up the personnel. They're going to get to Benghazi Airport. They're going to fly to Tripoli. C-17 in Tripoli is going to pick them up and fly them to Germany. In total, it takes them 24 hours from the time the first shots are fired to the time they're actually heading back to Germany itself. Now, back in Washington, once they get news of this attack, President Obama is going to convene a meeting with Secretary of Defense Panetta, Chair Joint Chiefs of Staff Jack Dempsey. He's going to give a very clear order that Panetta is going to testify is an extremely clear order, and that is do everything you can to save American lives. Panetta, as I'm going to talk about, is going to mistranslate this later on, but the 5 p.m. meeting, he's under the impression, do everything you can to save American lives. Panetta is going to go back to the Pentagon. They're going to begin planning. For the first time, this notion that this is due to an anti-Islamic film and that Ambassador Stevens has been taken hostage crops up into their discussions at 6 p.m. At 7 p.m., Panetta is going to say, I've seen this before. Go ahead and launch Complan 0300, which is a Special Forces counterterrorism rescue mission. Issue these orders. It's going to be a lull of several hours before our forces actually start moving. But at 7 p.m., Panetta has already issued the orders to start moving forces. They're then going to meet at 7:30 p.m. at an interagency meeting headed by Hillary Clinton. This is where they're going to double down on the narrative that this is due to an anti-Islamic film and Ambassador Stevens has been taken hostage. A little bit more on this later in the instrumental part that Clinton played in that whole messaging campaign. Eventually, they're going to move forces several hours later. These forces do not arrive in Libya until 23 hours later. No forces are actually ever planned to go to the CIA annex in Benghazi. The forces themselves don't get to Benghazi because the violence there is over. They land 23 hours later. They're setting up for what they assume is going to be regional unrest. A little bit more about that later. Once again, a wrongful assumption. This is what it looks like for the timeline of the individuals involved. A lot of focus early. With meetings trying to figure out what's going on, calls to foreign leaders. There's that crucial 7:30 p.m. meeting I'm going to talk about a little bit later. By 10:30, almost all these individuals, 10:30 local time in Washington, almost all these individuals are going to testify, I was done for the night. I thought the violence in Libya was over. I had issued my orders. I'm going home for the night. Unfortunately, the violence had not ended by that point in time. So now on the surface, and this is all from the Benghazi Committee report, on the surface I would argue this all seems extremely comprehensive. We know exactly what was going on, both in terms of within Libya itself and with the Obama administration response. However, as I argue in Fire Alarm, we still don't know who was actually in charge of conducting Libyan policy for the US government. We don't know if the violence was actually due to this anti-Islamic video, as the administration stated in the days after the attack. And we know that the military was very slow in its response. This came out from the report. We don't know why the military was slow in its response. Okay, hypotheses. This goes back to the congressional investigations that are partisan. First one, you're going to focus on that rival political candidate with your investigation. Second thing, because it's all part of the partisan brand, members themselves are going to attend high-profile events to kind of boost their own reputation with the population. And third thing here, the staff members that have this party loyalist streak to them with Capitol Hill experience, they're going to get the plum assignments on the committee themselves. Once again, to make sure party strategy is carried out. Benghazi committee is going to start with a whole bunch of directives. Don't worry, you don't need to read it, because I've summarized it here. It's supposed to be a very, very comprehensive investigation is the bottom line. Now, when I worked here, here's a timeline of the investigation. When I worked there, this was a very sleepy, slow investigation up until March 2nd, 2015. Does anybody know what happened on March 2nd, 2015? I can tell you Hillary Clinton certainly knows. I'm sorry? Absolutely. New York Times is going to come up with an article, a front-page article on March 2nd, 2015, saying Hillary Clinton's been using private emails. 2 days later, the AP is going to put out a press release saying not only that, but she was using a private server. Now, I've actually spoken about this in public. To me, this is where the investigation is going to shift. I'm going to go through the numbers of this towards becoming very much a partisan, let's get Hillary investigation. Paul Ryan is eventually going to get elected speaker. He's going to shift it back to looking more like an objective investigation. So going back to those party unity scores, these are the votes for the Republicans that were selected for the committee. As you can see here, Trey Gowdy himself is voting with Republicans 97% of the time. The lowest on there, Martha Roby at 93%. When I get to the January 6th committee, these numbers are going to be like 99% and 100%. In fact, the lowest one on here is John Boehner at 90%. So now I argued there's three ways you can actually look at what an investigation's focused on. You can look at who they're actually interviewing, what press releases they're actually issuing, and then what documents they're requesting the executive branch. So the first one here in terms of witness interviews, State Department's the second line. By far, the number of witnesses they brought in for the investigation were State Department. Those interviews were longer. They brought in more high-profile State Department, including all of Hillary Clinton and her inner circle. More members attended those interviews. More staff members attended those interviews. Now, it wouldn't be Texas A&M without some statistical analysis. So in terms of logit regression, if you remember, hypothesis one was you focus on your rival presidential candidate. In terms of who was attending these witness interviews by member, Trey Gowdy, Jim Jordan, and Mike Pompeo. If it was if it was Hillary Clinton and her inner circle, they were going to attend those witness interviews. Now, for those that are guessing correctly, why is not Roscom up there? Because Roscom only attended high-profile interviews. His numbers actually drop out. You couldn't do statistical analysis on him because there's only 4 cases. Panetta, Clinton, Blumenthal, Petraeus. Otherwise, he was not involved in the investigation. Okay, so hypothesis 2, if it was a high-profile event, how likely was it going to be that a member was going to attend that event? And here you get Susan Brooks, Jim Jordan, Mike Pompeo, Martha Roby, and Westmoreland are going to be there. I would argue this was to boost their individual reputation. Everybody knows who Trey Gowdy is. Nobody necessarily knows who the rest of these are. They're going to try to boost their own reputation by attending these events. Now, as I said, if it was Hillary Clinton or her inner circle there for a witness interview, 61% chance that Trey Gowdy was going to attend that interview. I'm sorry, his chances increased by 61%. If it was a high-profile event, I had the numbers here. So Susan Brooks, her chances of attending that were going to increase by 45%, etc. Now, when it actually comes to the veteran majority up here, and what I mean is those with Capitol Hill experience are experienced staff members. What did it look like if it was a witness interview for them? If it was a State Department witness, they actually were less likely to be there. If it was Hillary Clinton and her inner circle, statistically significant that they were going to be there. If it was Jim Jordan, also statistically significant that they were going to be there. Does anybody want to take a guess as to why? Why would you have Capitol Hill veterans attending interviews that Jim Jordan's also at? Republican Party, I argue, is starting to fracture at this point in time between Boehner, what would be termed an establishment individual, and Jim Jordan, who's the populist wing. These two guys, there's a Vanity Fair article. These two individuals hate each other. And so my argument here is whenever Jim Jordan was there, John Boehner was assigning party loyalists to attend those interviews to make sure Jim Jordan was towing the party line. And what does it look like? Jim Jordan was attending, chances increased by 47%, that the majority of the staff in attendance were going to be these Capitol Hill veterans. Now, were these Capitol Hill veterans actually getting more of the plum assignments? The numbers bear this out. They attended on average 7 more interviews. If it was high profile, they attended on average 3 more high profile interviews. Now, the second way we can look at this is what is the committee issuing in terms of its press releases? As I argued before that New York Times article, this was very sleepy, slow investigations. The numbers support this, 3 press releases total. Once the New York Times article comes out, this thing kicks into overdrive. 26 press releases about Hillary Clinton alone, 3 about State Department, 0 about any other executive branch agency. Once Paul Ryan takes over the speakership, it's going to shift towards a more balanced investigation. Now, for the third measure, what does it look like in terms of document requests? Once again, State Department is getting the majority of the document requests, 15 in total out of 27, if my math's correct. Committee itself is going to receive about 74,000 pages of documents from the executive branch for its investigation. 72,000 plus come from the State Department. This is what it looks like under the speakers. Once again, the numbers bear it out that Boehner himself measured his witness interviews, press releases, document requests is very much focused on State Department. Once Paul Ryan takes over, essentially after Hillary Clinton's October 2015 hearing, it becomes much more of a balance. There's more of a shift back towards the other executive branch agencies. So now, as I said, the entire purpose of these investigations is to bring back down the poll numbers of your rival presidential candidate. And here we can see Hillary Clinton's going to suffer a 5-point loss as a result of this investigation. The committee is going to be established. She's at 47%. By the time the report's issued in June of 2016, her numbers are down to 42%. But what we don't know is what was actually occurring when it comes to Libyan policy. Who in the Obama administration was in charge of U.S. policy in Libya? The committee itself is going to spend an inordinate amount of time, particularly during the Clinton hearing, trying to get details on this, trying to figure out what was going on. To no success. There's the Roscom hearing to questions of Clinton, where I think you're in charge of foreign policy in Libya. She's going to say, no, the president was in charge. Roscom doesn't have really any evidence other than the Jake Sullivan email. He's easily going to get shot down. And that was because I would argue that they didn't go after these middle-level bureaucrats in terms of the investigation, not able to determine who was actually in charge of the U.S. foreign policy there. However, plenty of public sources have conveyed to us that there was very much a divide. So there's a divide between Boehner and Jordan. When it comes to the Republican Party, there's a divide in terms of foreign policy between Obama and Clinton. Obama is very much from the Scowcroft model. He does not believe in nation building. If he does, it has to be a multilateral approach, as opposed to Clinton, Susan Rice, Samantha Power, who believe in what is termed smart power. That is, you lead with diplomacy. As a last resort, you use military power. Clinton is initially going to win this argument with President Obama. You have the NATO intervention, the toppling of Gaddafi, approved but supported by Clinton. And then we get to this date here, July 7th, 2012. This was the first national election in Libya post-Gaddafi, considered extremely successful. This is very much the mission accomplished moment for the President Obama administration when it comes to Libya. That was up until the terrorist attack on September 11th, 2012. At this point in time, President Obama is essentially going to say, I'm finished with nation building in Libya. He's going to try to stand up a a Libyan national army that the U.S. is willing to trade, advise, and assist on, but there's not going to be any more U.S. direct intervention in Libya. Still becoming an extremely violent place. 2014, they essentially shut down U.S. operations in Libya. So now, we know after the attack itself, and this became a huge controversy between Mitt Romney and President Obama, who's a CNN reporter. They get into a presidential debate on whether or not the Obama administration really blamed this on a terrorist attack or not. What I found is that the 7:30 p.m. meeting where this narrative gels up that this is very much due to this anti-Islamic video that occurred. There was a protest in Cairo earlier that day. We think the violence in Libya itself is due to this anti-Islamic video. That crops up at the 7:30 p.m. meeting. After that meeting, Ben Rhodes, who's a strategic communication advisor for Obama, Jake Sullivan, who's a Clinton deputy, are going to have a phone conversation. Soon thereafter, Jake Sullivan is going to issue talking points at 9:32 p.m. that night, so before the CIA annex is even attacked, where he's going to conflate the attack with this anti-Islamic video, as I'll show in a little bit. The Obama administration is going to continue that narrative. Ben Rhodes is going to say, Jake Sullivan, thank you very much for those talking points. Literally going to copy them. President Obama is then going to give his Rose Garden speech the next day. Hillary Clinton is going to give a September 13th speech using those same words. Susan Rice is then going to go on national TV and essentially use these Jake Sullivan written talking points. This is what it looks like in detail. Take my word for it. In the days following. Now we get to, Obama administration is going to say, nope, it wasn't us. It was the intelligence committee that wrote intelligence community that wrote the talking points, the anti-Islamic talking points. However, Susan Rice, Ben Rhodes, So that was actually Miss Brooks and Florian, if you guys are out there, welcome to my talk. My daughter's second grade class, who's supposedly zooming in. Intelligence community is going to issue talking points in response to requests from Congress. It's going to be very bland. Oops, there we go. These are the talking points they issued. Ben Rhodes, Susan Rice are going to testify. We did not use the talking points when we went to national TV. And in fact, these talking points don't mention an anti-Islamic video itself. That brings us to Sunday following the attacks.
Madam Ambassador, he says that this is something that's been in the planning stages for months. I understand you have been saying that you think it was spontaneous. Are we not on the same page here?
Well, Bob, let me tell you what we understand to be the assessment at present. First of all, very importantly, as you discussed with the President, there's an investigation that the United States government will launch led by the FBI. That has begun.
But they're not there.
They're not on the ground yet, but they have already begun looking at all sorts of evidence of various sorts already available to them and to us, and they will get on the ground and continue the investigation. So we'll want to see the results of that investigation to draw any definitive conclusions. But based on the best information we have to date, what our assessment is as of the present is in fact what it began spontaneously in Benghazi as a reaction to what had transpired some hours earlier in Cairo, where of course, as you know, there was a violent protest outside of our embassy sparked by this hateful video. But soon after that spontaneous protest began outside of our consulate in Benghazi, we believe that it looks like extremist elements, individuals joined in that effort with heavy weapons of the sort that are unfortunately readily now available in Libya post-revolution, and that it spun from there into something much, much more violent.
Okay. So starting at 9:32 p.m., as I said, Jake Sullivan circulates a draft of talking points. Clinton's going to issue them that same night at 10:08 p.m. Those talking points, as I've talked about, both Sullivan's going to copy them for Clinton, Ben Rhodes is going to copy them for Obama and for Susan Rice. Those talking points end up on the Sunday talk shows, some of that same verbiage for Susan Rice. Now, another thing that the Benghazi Committee is going to make a lot of hay out of the fact the military was slow to respond. It took them 23 hours. The Benghazi Committee is not able to provide an answer for why it took so long for that. Now up here is just a summary of the military actions. I've covered most of this. Once again, you had that Obama meeting in the White House, do everything you can to save American lives. Panetta is going to go back to the Pentagon. They're going to conjure up, oh no, Ambassador Stevens has been taken hostage. 7 p.m., Panetta is going to order units that are specified under the Con Plan 0300. 7:30 p.m., you're going to have that White House interagency meeting led by Clinton. They're basically going to double down once again. Ambassador Stevens has been taken hostage. This is due to an anti-Islamic video. 9 p.m., orders are sent out. However, it's going to take several hours for those units to actually deploy. So now, Pentagon officials, as best as we know this, in Washington, they did not follow what is termed the joint planning process. So if a crisis pops up, the military, per doctrine, is trained and is educated to follow a 7-step process. And why is that? Because assumptions become risk, becomes mission failure. You want to eliminate as many assumptions as possible. This is an iterative process. You're constantly bringing in new information into the process as it becomes available, updating your information, and changing your game plan. This did not occur in Washington. They did not go through the joint planning process. They essentially took Con Plan 0300 off the shelf, which is like taking a cookbook off the shelf and using it without knowing what your cooking skills are, what event you're facing, or even what ingredients you have. AFRICOM staff was actually going through the joint planning process. They were woken up in the middle of the night, but nobody was listening to them. So if you look at the 7-step process, you try to reconfigure it backwards, and what they were doing, they missed 4 of the 7 steps. This is what's termed an operational approach. So what's going to be your end goal? Your end goal is given to you by senior decision makers. President Obama, in this case, gave that end goal of do everything you can to save American lives. As you can see here with the end goal, it is not the same as what President Obama issued. Panetta and the Pentagon officials did not have the authority to change that end goal, but they did. They changed it for posture for follow-on missions, conduct stability operations, etc. Oh, and by the way, Ambassador Stevens has been taken hostage. So you have to line up a rescue operation for that. And why is it there's this crucial meeting I've been talking about, the 7:30 meeting where groupthink occurs? Janet's definition of groupthink, you basically have this in-group pressure to basically have cohesiveness, to not speak truth to power. So if you're a senior decision maker at one of these meetings and you put out an idea, it's going to be your own personal interest as a staffer to go along with this idea. At this meeting, Clinton's going to be handed a note essentially saying Ambassador Stevens has been taken hostage. At this meeting, it then becomes doubling down, as I've talked about. He has been taken hostage. We have time, as we had time in Somalia with our rescue operation. We have time to respond to this. Let's start moving with Con Plan 0300. And what also becomes part of this meeting is, once again, this anti-Islamic video. Oh no, this violence is due to an anti-Islamic video. There has been, at this point in time, no intelligence to support that notion. So in the end, so I picked a lot on the Republicans. Let's look at what the Democrats look like for January 6th. Here are our party loyalty scores. So you can see there, 2 of them, the lowest score they had was 97%. What does it look like in terms of Trump's poll numbers? His were never that good to begin with. So impeachment's going to start 37%. By the time the second impeachment article is introduced, he's down to 33%. So how do we avoid this partisan warfare that's going on? Well, I'd argue if there's ever an investigation of this type, such as the Benghazi investigation, the January 6th investigation, what reforms were actually introduced by Congress? What legislation was introduced to the floor? Was this all an accountability exercise, trying to hold somebody accountable? Perhaps it is, but is there also legislation introduced as a result of this? Senate tends to have more of a professional relationship when it comes to these investigations. They have rules in place that actually protect that minority party. When it comes to the House, basically anything goes. So when I was there, the Democrats were not allowed access to the transcripts, to read the transcripts of what had occurred there. Second, these staff members I talked about, it's all about hiring party loyalists for your staff. Congressional Research Service provides us a very good model on what this should look like. Congressional Research Service is basically the subject matter experts for Congress. If you have a Congress, or if you have a question, you submit it to CRS. They provide you a very academic, detailed, objective background paper on whatever your question was. And then finally, run it in tandem with the Presidential Commission. We know what success looks like with the 9/11 Commission. I would argue there hasn't been any kind of partisan argument against it. So simply running this in tandem with the Presidential Commission and then leaving it up to the voters to deciding who actually lays out the truth. And with that, that is all I have. So once again, hi, Mrs. Brooks, second grade class, if you're still there. What are your questions? Okay.
I'll take the cards if you have cards. If not, I'm just going to ask questions. I thought that was fascinating. The only thing I have to complain is that your book cost $100.
That's a separate talk. That is a racket. Yeah, I apologize.
Well, you don't have to apologize. I think this needs to get out. I think it's absolutely fascinating. There,
I don't know what that is.
see, this is on? Is that can you hear me up there? Yes. Okay. There is a book that was, and this may sound unrelated, it's directly related. There is a book written by one of my favorite political scientists, Nelson Polsby, called The Consequences of Party Reform, which looks at the McGovern Commission reforms of the Democratic Party after the disastrous 1968 convention in Chicago, which helped defeat Hubert Humphrey. And he argues that the movement toward binding presidential primary elections away from the old convention system where individuals had some discretion as to who they voted for has been a catastrophe for the Democratic Party. And what he did not write, because it hadn't happened yet, is the Republicans moved toward the same process later. And I believe, I haven't written this article yet, I'd like to at some point, that the current dysfunction of the American political system is that we don't have functioning parties anymore where individuals have discretion. In the old days, even though there were deals made behind closed doors for president, who did they produce? Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt, Eisenhower, Lincoln. I mean, these were not small people. He would argue, Nelson Polsby, that there's been a deterioration in the quality of presidential candidates since we democratized, small d, the process by eliminating the elite's influence over the process. What I saw in you may not see the parallel, but by going against the old system of seniority was a way of balancing this system, and it was an elite-controlled system that allowed people to rise in the ranks because they had been around so long, instead of just based on pure party loyalty. And what you seem to be arguing is that has been, I wouldn't say a catastrophe, but very bad in terms of the partisanship. The reason that the primaries now are not choosing good candidates is because the people who vote in primaries in both parties tend to be on the far left or the far right of their parties. That did not used to be the case in terms of the conventions. The conventions ruled from the center as opposed to the far left or the far right. So I see a direct parallel between Nelson Polsby's book and your presumption in this book. I got to read the whole book though, because people are blaming the individuals, Trump or Biden or whoever. The question is, has there been a general deterioration? There has. There used to be I know this is your talk, but let me just make this fine point. When I served in the legislature for 12 years in Massachusetts, the old party system was you ran for local office, 2/3 of the Massachusetts House and Senate were former local officials. 2/3 of the U.S. Congress in those days, this is a long time ago, I'm dating myself now, 2/3 of the U.S. are former state legislators. 2/3 of the Senate were former congressmen. So there was a career ladder, and you did not move up through the system unless you had experience. That is no longer the case. I haven't done the statistical analysis, but I'm sure some political scientist has done it. It's not a good thing. Not a good thing.
No, yeah, I absolutely agree with your statement on this removal of the committee chairs based on seniority.
Yep.
We know during the Vietnam War, the Democrats held the Senate, and they were with the Vietnam War, independent of what the LBJ administration was doing. But once they independently became against the Vietnam War, there's nothing LBJ could do to stop them from voicing their opposition
Right.
to the war, and we've lost that now.
Right.
A good example is McCarthy gets vacated. Why is that? Because he actually compromised with the Democrats.
Right. Very interesting.
Yeah, and so now there's in the 25 Republicans that didn't vote for Jim Jordan for Speaker. Now there's talk, okay, we're going to primary them next. So there's this purification process that's going on, whereas that one chart shows that Republicans are becoming much more conservative, and I would argue the Democrats are becoming much more liberal as a result of this and crossing the aisles.
This is taking place at the state level. The Republican House members who voted to impeach Ken Paxton, they've been threatening to primary them,
yes.
the far right in the state. And the same thing happened to this Republican state senators who voted for his conviction in the Senate. The same pattern now of people being threatened. That did not happen in the old party system.
No, I completely agree.
Anyway, let me ask you a couple of questions. I know many of the people. I've never met Hillary Clinton, but I know Pat Kennedy very well. I never understood why they did not do more, because the stories I heard, which you just confirmed, the memo sat on his desk. It was not Hillary Clinton that didn't act, he didn't act. He is not a beloved figure among the career people. I mean, maybe in state, but in AID, he went to a Christmas party once with a devil's mask on, and he said, "I know you all hate me," and they all laughed, because they did, because he did enormous operational damage to AID. Well, not maliciously, but he did not want AID to have an independent capacity in the embassy, outside the embassies. And that damaged our ability to go see projects, to hire Foreign Service nationals, do a lot of stuff. And so he got away with all this. He was also deeply involved in what I would call a fiasco of the Coalition Provisional Authority in Iraq. He was running things in the background. I met him in Baghdad 2 months after the troops came in, and I almost said, what are you doing here? But he seemed to have gotten away with this. Am I wrong, or maybe not?
No, I completely agree. And that's why I had the slide up there of all these memos were basically going unanswered as he was sitting in Washington. I would make two arguments. First, he was very much an institution. I think he has 30 plus years in the State Department. So he was very good at covering his tracks.
Yep.
And then the second thing is, probably to his own benefit, he wasn't high level enough. So if you're the Republicans, you're like, we found the guy, Patrick Kennedy, and you go out to the American people and say, we got Patrick Kennedy. You never heard of him, and you're not going to do that political damage that you're
Well, the
trying to
problem
do.
is no one looked at the other things he did, which also had an effect on our foreign policy. But anyway, I'm going to make this personal. It's just the lack of response time. That's the other issue. Why did it take so long for the military to respond? And you seem to suggest that it's because they made a whole series of bad assumptions because they didn't follow the planning process that the U.S. military normally uses.
No, that's absolutely correct. They thought they had simple answers. They thought they had more time than they actually had, because with the previous hostage rescue operations, there was with the Alabama that was taken hostage by the Somali pirates. There was Jessica Buchanan and Paul Thiested, as I talked about. There was time associated with that. So what you simply do is special forces respond to it. And oh, by the way, we might have regional unrest due to this anti-Islamic video, so there's also time for that. But it's very clear for the military, if you get that end goal from the president in this particular case, do everything you can to save American lives, you don't have the discretion to violate that. And so there's been a lot of talk about this. Why weren't the F-16s launched from Aviano? Would that F-16s doing a flyover at Benghazi have been doing possibly something to save American lives? And there was never an adequate answer provided for that, other than we didn't think it was a good choice. But they did choose units that, once again, following what's referred to as the elements of operational design, that had no capability to respond in time. To give you a good example, the FAST team was deployed from Spain. The aircraft that actually could get them to Libya was located in Germany. So they were never going to get there. And then you have the Commander in Extremis Force, which is considered the quick response force for the military. They're the ones that are supposed to rapidly respond to something. However, they were off on a training exercise in Croatia. Now, you would think the anniversary is September 11th. We probably want to have a quick reaction force on the ready. No, they were on a training exercise. And not only that, but they didn't have a forklift to load their equipment up into a plane. So they had to find a guy to go drive 180 miles to go retrieve this forklift so they could load their equipment onto the plane. But with that said, they were actually the first unit to deploy. And their commander was very...
Is that in your book?
Yes.
Interesting. 2 more minutes. Anybody have cards? No cards from anyone? Can I get to ask all the questions without any input from the audience? Let me ask one other question. How has your book been reviewed by any of the foreign affairs or any?
So, yes and no. It's off for review. So I've heard...
When was it published?
January of this year.
So it's relatively new.
Yes. So I know it's off to a lot of those magazines, and HNet's about ready to come out with.
We could do a transcription of what you just talked about and make it a Scowcroft paper if you don't mind.
No, yeah.
Did we record this? Okay. We're going to do that, by the way. It's very interesting.
I am actually producing, so the Air Force, for one of my classes, I'm going to produce a History Channel-esque documentary on basically on this talk.
We could have a link for it in the
Yes.
Scowcroft Institute. Yeah. If you didn't submit a card, anybody just want to raise their hand and ask a question? No. Well, thank you very much for coming, Brad. It's
No,
been
yeah,
absolutely
thank you, sir.
fascinating.
Yeah. Thank you all for being a wonderful audience and listening patiently to me.